45 minutes, we're going to spend some time together making a recipe step by step, and this is a fun one. But you know, before I get into my recipe, which is a Basque cheesecake, you might know it as a burnt cheesecake. What I want to do is say hello to some very important people, as I usually do when I get started. It's great to see some familiar names coming up on the chat thread. Hermione from Greece, haven't heard from Cherry yet, but also to say hello to my mom and dad, and Michino, and Bonnie down the street, who usually gets a sample of whatever it is I make today. I would like to say hi to Kathy, and additionally to those of you who are joining my live streams for the first time. I've been so fortunate to have you join the Oh Yum subscription family. So it's been a while since I've done a live stream. So if you're joining me for the first time, we're just gonna walk through this recipe, but this is your chance to ask me baking questions. They can be specifically about this Basque cheesecake recipe, but they can be general baking questions. And then the good news is I've got more live streams planned. So I'll be right back here a week from today, this same time slot. So if you're joining me from the Philippines, you got to stay up a little late. But we're going to have some fun. And this is Oh Yum 201. Let me get right into it. Welcome to Oh Yum 201. This is where we take our baking up a notch. Maybe you joined me for Oh Yum 101 live, or you can catch those videos right here on the Oh Yum channel. But we're kind of getting more into the nuanced baking with specialty recipes and fine-tuned techniques. Today's recipe is a Basque cheesecake. You might know of it as a burnt cheesecake, and this is different than the American New York style cheesecake. What you can expect from a Basque cheesecake is that caramelized top. You can expect a ricotta-like cheesecake on the outside, but more of a custard-like filling in the center. So it's amazing that one cheesecake delivers a variety of textures, and the ease of it, no crust. I saw there was a note from Nazreen before we started our live stream asking about a soggy crust to a cheesecake, because of course you have to make it ahead, let it chill, and then once it chills, sometimes the moisture from the cheesecake seeps into the crust. The two things you can do to prevent that, if you're making a more conventional cheesecake, is do make sure that cheesecake has cooled fully to room temperature before you put it in the fridge, because then you won't get condensation build up. Another trick is, if you like the flavor of the crust, but you want to make it a little more airtight, is add a couple extra tablespoons of melted butter to the crumb mixture. That'll crisp it up when it's in the oven, and give it an extra 2 minutes in the oven to toast up crisper to balance out that. But this Basque cheesecake is without a crust. We're just essentially baking a custard in a dry oven at a high temperature. We're doing the opposite of all of the conventional rules you have been taught when it comes to making a New York style cheesecake. So whatever those instructions are, out the window, we're starting new here. The first thing we have to do, what doesn't change, is you need a springform pan, because that way it's easy to extract the cheesecake. But if you don't have a springform pan, you can use a regular cake pan. Just make sure it has very high sides. I still use a springform pan because this is a taller pan than a regular cake pan. The volume of this cheesecake fills right to the top of the pan, so you don't want it spilling over. You can lightly grease the pan if you want. And of course, you've probably seen me do this trick before. When you're assembling your springform pan, even though it comes to you with the lip upwards, that can make it hard to pull your cheesecake out. Make sure you invert it, so that way the lip is down, and give it a double check to make sure you've got it firmly in place. Now, what characterizes a Basque cheesecake, and this comes from the northern region of Spain, bordering on France, is this rumpled parchment paper that's on the outside. So it serves to hold the cheesecake in, because it's going to expand in the oven. But it's got that beautiful ruffled effect, and that gives the cheesecake a little texture on the edges. So where normally you would cut out a circle of your parchment and then line the bottom and sides of the pan, I want you to intentionally crumple up your parchment. This softens it a little bit, so that way it's easier to press into your pan and it'll find the outside edges. Now you can see with this first sheet, and you do want the large bits of overhang here. You can see that there's still space visible. You can see the pan through the paper. So that means you take a second sheet and do the exact same thing. So it's easier to shape, it stays in place. And now you can fold it just a little bit over the edges. So when you pour in your filling, it won't go anywhere, it'll stay in place. And you can expect a little bit of the filling to leak in between the two layers, but it'll start cooking at a high temperature very quickly, so that outside will set very quickly. So that's the second thing you want to do. If you haven't preheated your oven, if you are baking along with me, set that oven to 400 degrees. Now you're probably used to a conventional cheesecake baking at 300, 325 tops. This bakes at a super high temperature because we want that caramel to cook. And you're gonna be amazed at the texture of this cheesecake batter when we make it. I'm gonna take a little peek at the thread to see what kind of questions you've got coming my way. Oh, hello from Zambia, Venezuela, Peru, Mexico, Philippines. It's great to see. Oh, and hello from Turkey. It's great to hear from you. And thank you to everyone who is joining me for the first time as we make this burnt cheesecake, otherwise known as a Basque cheesecake. So like a conventional New York style cheesecake, it starts with the cream cheese. I have 3 packages, so this is 750 grams. 24 ounces if you're weighing in ounces. This has been softened at room temperature. I've let this sit out for a couple of hours. If you haven't pulled out your cream cheese in advance, don't soften it in the microwave, but cut it into pieces and spread it out on a single layer on your plate, and within 30 minutes, it will have softened up. So this goes into our mixer, and consistent with most cheesecake recipes, we have to soften the cream cheese and scrape the bowl often. So that's the first thing I'll do right now. I'll start on low speed and then increase the speed. You can use electric beaters, of course, to do this. I dare say you could do this recipe by hand because you'll be amazed at how fluid this cheesecake batter actually is. And of course, we have my sweetie, Michael, behind the cameras, running the cameras right now so he can switch to different views. Hey, Amanda, you joined us for the live stream. We had a little pop-up live stream on Valentine's Day, and it was just to get ourselves back into doing live streams. And so I made a chocolate orange mousse. And Amanda, I'm glad you made it and glad you enjoyed it too. That set is just right, isn't it? It's so silky and light. Oh, it's great to see everyone. Argentina. Okay. Shailene, I see you're asking about the water bath and when not to bake with a water bath. I'm going to stop and scrape the bowl while I answer that question. Yes, so when you're making a very delicate New York style cheesecake, some recipes call for a water bath, and that's to basically mellow the cooking method of your cheesecake, because a cheesecake, even though it has the word cake in it, is actually a custard, especially this recipe. And so you cook a creme brulee, a creme caramel, any custard you cook in a water bath so that the gentle heat of the water is actually cooking the cheesecake, not the more aggressive dry heat of an oven without the water. And so if you bake a cheesecake in a water bath, you can set your oven temperature higher so that the water stays nice and warm. It complicates the recipe, and if your pan isn't, you have to put foil around your pan so you don't get water in there. I try and work with recipes that don't require that, so I cook at a lower temperature, a little bit longer. What's interesting is this Basque cheesecake is the opposite of that. We have our oven set high because we actually want to overcook it on the outside so that it browns or burns almost on top. And that develops its flavor. And you get that contrasting texture, sort of ricotta-like on the outside, soft and custard-like in the center. I'm going to give this another mix now that I've scraped the bowl, just for a second. That was a very good question. Hey, someone from Malaysia, Berjaya alumni or alumnus. Great to see you. We've actually, both Michael and I have been to Berjaya Culinary School in Kuala Lumpur a few times and did demos of the school. It's a beautiful dining room. So I hope all is well with you. Oh, this is interesting. Alden is saying that they've tried making Basque cheesecake, but it leaks water after cooled and chilled in the fridge. Why is that? Using cornstarch instead of AP flour. Now, I don't think the cornstarch should have made a difference, Alden. So I'm curious about that. I hope you were using, well, I haven't had that happen, so I don't know quite what the answer is, unless the fat content wasn't high enough between your cream cheese and the cream that held everything together. So I would say a definite tip, and you'll see it in the instructions right below this video screen, to cool this cheesecake on the counter for a full 2 hours before you put it in the fridge. And that is to help prevent condensation. And I think that's where any water, it might not actually be coming out of the cheesecake. It might just simply be the condensation. If a warm item goes into the fridge too soon, you'll get that condensation buildup. So now that my cheesecake, my cream cheese is softened, I can add the sugar. So 1.5 cups or 300 grams, and I'm going to add gradually as I'm mixing. And really, that's so that I don't have lumps build up. And of course, guess what? Scrape the bowl, scrape the bowl, scrape the bowl. So in it goes. And it really doesn't matter what speed you're mixing your cheesecake filling at this point. It's only when you start adding the egg that it really makes a difference. So I'll give a chance for that sugar to dissolve into the cream cheese. And immediately you can see how the cream cheese is starting to soften up a little bit further. And making it nice and fluffy is absolutely fine. That's, I think, what's really special about a Basque cheesecake is it's got a lightness to it, where a New York cheesecake is creamy, but it's quite dense at the same time. This has an airiness to it because of the quantity of the eggs and the high temperature we're cooking it at. So I'll give this another good scrape right to the bottom, and then I will keep adding. Whoop. It gets messy. There we go. Now I'll keep adding the sugar. Oh, Adam's asking a great question. Is this suitable for a food processor? 100%. You can make this recipe in a food processor. Don't put it on a full-on whir, the power on. Always pulse when you're adding your ingredients if you're making this recipe in the food processor. That will work just fine. Oh, and hello, Zen from Vienna. And this is a good question, not related to the cheesecake, but I'd like to touch on the question. Zen is interested in using cornstarch instead of gelatin in some recipes, like the chocolate mousse that I just made. In the more suitable replacement for gelatin in most desserts is actually agar-agar, which is a seafood-based, it's vegan, seaweed product. And you can treat it measure for measure. If you're using agar-agar powder, you treat it just like gelatin. You bloom it in cool water, the same measure. If the recipe, my mousse recipe calls for half a teaspoon of gelatin, use half a teaspoon of agar powder. You add it to the milk. The key difference is gelatin doesn't have to be boiled to be activated. It just needs to be dissolved. Agar-agar needs to come to a full boil. So plan your recipe accordingly so that you can bring it up to a full boil so that it thickens and then sets. And the set and the texture is very much the same. So that is a great question to ask them. And Nabil is asking, when's the next live? Well, I hope you're enjoying this already. The next one is a week today, next Thursday, same time. And Oh, shall I reveal what I'll be making? You know what? We've got 219 likes. When I hit 300 likes, I'm going to tell you what I'll be making next Thursday. So if you're just joining us, make sure you like the video. We're making Basque cheesecake. And I'll announce what I'll be making next week. Oh, and now Susan's asking, I love these questions coming in. This is why I love doing the live streams. Sandra's asking, can you scale down this recipe? Yes, because this makes a lot of cheesecake. You can, I would cut it in half safely. Your cook time will be dramatically changed. If you have a smaller pan, you can put it in. That would definitely help. So that you get some height out of it. But your cook time will definitely be reduced, not cut in half, even if you're cutting the proportions in half, but probably cut by 30%. And I'll touch on how you tell when your cheesecake is done once I get all the ingredients added. I'm glad this is a singular activity because your questions are so great, and I'm happy to be keeping an eye on the thread as I work through and scrape this batter down. And now it's time to mix in the flour. We had someone say they've made the recipe using cornstarch. If you want to keep this gluten-free, you can use cornstarch in place of the 2 tablespoons of flour. So I leave that up to you. It just helps bind it because while this is a custard, we want to be able to slice it cleanly. So that little addition of a starch, there is starch within flour, so whether it's flour or cornstarch, you want that. And it helps contribute to a silky texture. And that's a quick mix in. Now it's time to add the eggs. And the basic, when I'm developing recipes, the basic ratio, when I'm at a starting point for a recipe, for every one package, for every 250 grams of cream cheese, I add 1 egg. And then I know I get a nice set for a classic American New York style cheesecake. This is different. This is from the Basque region of Spain, and it's more custard-like. It calls for more eggs. I still have to add a cup and a half of whipping cream to this filling. So it's going to be very, very fluid. So you need that many eggs to set it. So you've got 5 eggs and 1 egg yolk. So what I want to do is crack my eggs into a bowl first because it'll be easier to add them. That way, once I whisk them all up together, instead of glopping in one at a time, which I have to admit I do out of habit, I've discovered it's easier if you whisk them up together. Now you'll notice I'm not adding vanilla. I'm not adding lemon zest. For a traditional Basque cheesecake, you have no added flavorings, no other flavorings, because we want just to appreciate that sort of burnt layer, sweet layer on top of the cheesecake, along with just that sort of cream cheese flavor all on its own. So I'm just separating my 1 yolk out. I'll set that aside. And just with a fork, break those eggs, break the yolks in, and give it a little stir. And that way it'll be easier to add a little at a time. There we go. Oh, Luke, you're asking a good question, and I don't know that I have the answer to it, about an egg substitute. This recipe really does rely on the eggs, not just for the set of the cheesecake, but we actually want the cheesecake to souffle up and then collapse down. And I don't know that an egg substitute would do that. I would have to start playing with silken tofu combined with aquafaba, which is the liquid from a tin of chickpeas that whips up like egg whites. You'd have to almost play with a different recipe. So a very good question to ask. And those are the ones I like because they get me thinking about how can we adapt. Oh, good question, Milton. How many grams of eggs? Michael, help me with the math quickly. 5 eggs, 1 yolk, so that means 165? 5 times, no. 30 grams, yeah.
330.
330. 330 grams of eggs. Whew. All right, we need another coffee. All right, so now I'm pouring in the eggs a little bit at a time. The first few additions are key in terms of making sure there are no lumps in the batter. So you'll scrape more often at the beginning, and once your batter starts liquefying, you can add more eggs quicker to the batter. And it is starting to soften up quite nicely. And of course, depending on where you're watching me, I was talking about softening the cream cheese. If you're in a nice warm climate right now, if you're watching me from South America where it's midsummer, or you're joining me from an equatorial country, you just pull out the cream cheese, 10 minutes before it's time to use it, especially if it's humid out. We do get our hot summers here, but we're midwinter here in Canada. Now you'll notice I'm not mixing on high speed when I'm adding the eggs. So you want a more moderate speed. It's not as fragile as a New York cheesecake where you really have to slow down the mixer. And there, as you can see, the eggs can get added a little faster. And as soon as they're combined, I'll stop the mixer. And now this will probably be the last scrape of the bowl because we've got a nice fluid batter. And the last ingredient to add is the whipping cream. And this is really what sets a Basque cheesecake apart in terms of the ingredient list for a cheesecake. Because this is what transforms it from something more dense to a soft, silky custard-like consistency. So still not on high speed, but not on the lowest setting. I have my 375 ml or 1 cup of whipping cream, which here is 35% fat. So long as you have a cream that is above 30%, you're fine. It can be richer, but not less than 30% fat. Oh, hello, Lee from Saskatoon. Yeah, you definitely have to let the cream cheese warm if you're in Saskatoon, especially this winter. My husband's family's from Saskatchewan. There's quite a few of them still there, and we've been hearing the reports of how frosty it's been. For those of you who live in warm climates, imagine what minus 40 Celsius feels like. It's a little chilly. So check out this batter. It is fluid. It's pourable. It is definitely a custard, not a conventional cheesecake. Whoop. Just don't want to make a mess as I cook along here. Now, if you want, you can, of course, put your pan on a tray if you're concerned about leaks, or just bringing it over to the oven. I'm going to be daring today. And just take it right to the oven. A reminder, your oven is set hot, ridiculously hot for a cheesecake if you're used to making New York cheesecakes, 400 degrees. And in goes the batter. Oh, and see how it fills right to the top of the pan. So this is why you need the springform pan, even though you've got the parchment paper in there, just to hold that volume of batter. And it's okay if it's not a perfect circle. It's supposed to have this rustic, inviting look to it. So now this gets put into the oven, and it takes about 40 minutes to cook. So you've got the high heat, you've got a big volume to cook through, and this is why you get the 2 textures in one cheesecake, because it sets more on the outside than it does in the center, but once it's cooled and chilled, you really appreciate that. And the crust is built because it essentially does caramelize on the outside, but without a distinctive crust on its own. What counts is the burnt top to it. So I'm gonna pop this in the oven, and oh, hello everyone. Nice to see you live too. Good question. What size is the pan? This is a 9-inch springform pan, 23 centimeters. If you have a 10-inch, which is another common springform size, that will work absolutely fine. Don't go smaller though, or you're going to have cheesecake batter running everywhere. So very good question. Oh, and I'll tackle that buttermilk question too, because we have, don't worry, I'm not gonna make you wait for 40 minutes while this goes into the oven. In it goes, middle rack. And this oven has a convection fan. The oven automatically adapts for the fan temperature. If you're baking in a convection oven and you don't have the oven doesn't adjust to the size, you want to lower the temperature by about, oh, well, thank you, Michael. I didn't realize that was in the shot. You don't want to look at a messy bowl. So you want to set the oven to 375, that is 190 Celsius as opposed to 200 Celsius in order to compensate for the air circulating around the fan. But that too is another exception. Usually when you bake a cheesecake, you want that slow, gentle heat and you don't want the convection fan. But here we actually want the cheesecake. You'll see it rise up, and guess what else is going to happen with the cheesecake? It's going to crack. It'll crack around the outside edges where the eggs are cooking faster than the eggs in the center, and you'll know you're getting close to done when you see those cracks develop. The good news is once the cheesecake cools, those cracks come back together, but that's part of the recipe. So I don't want you to panic when you see those cracks. It's part of the recipe. And what you will notice, there's my cheesecake. As I mentioned, the cheesecake takes about, oh, thank you for pointing that out, Ahmad. I'll talk about the cheesecake in a second. We've hit well over 300 likes. I promised I would tell you what I'm making next week after 300 likes, and we're at 365 already. What I will be making next week is a chocolate vanilla marble swirl cake that actually has two slightly different cake batters. Sometimes you see marble cake recipes that just take one base cake batter and then stir a bit of chocolate into the other. I don't find that fully delivers on that contrast between chocolate and vanilla. So I have two slightly different recipes that I swirl together, but the real winner is the marble swirl glaze I put on top. It's over the top decadent. It looks gorgeous. So this is a tray style cake. You could make it as a bundt if you wanted to, but I make it as a tray cake so that this glaze can go on nice and thick, and it is absolutely gorgeous. So I know you'll want to join me next week for that. And it will be, that's the 24th at 12 noon Eastern time. We base that on Toronto, New York time here. So let's go back to this cheesecake, our ta-da moment. Look at that beautiful, it's not actually burnt, but it is definitely richly caramelized top to the cheesecake. And so you can see where the cheesecake has risen at the outside edge, but is kind of flat and level in the center. And what would be the best camera angle, Michael? Cheesecake cam. Okay. And it's not perfect around the outside edges. It's not supposed to be. And you can kind of see where there were a few cracks as it was baking, but now it has all sunk and settled into place. So nothing to disrupt the beautiful look of this cheesecake. What's interesting is you use this color as your guide to check the doneness. I think that is one of the most difficult things to tell when you're making a cheesecake. How do I know when it's done? And because you saw how fluid that batter is, if you shake this cheesecake hot from the oven, it is going to, as I say in the instructions, definitely quiver. It's not like it's going to be almost set. It will seem like it's quite fluid in the center. This caramelization only happens in the last 10 to 12 minutes of baking. So don't panic if you've had your cheesecake in the oven for a full 30 minutes already and you're thinking, well, what have I done wrong? It's not caramelizing. That caramelization happens at the very last minute. Those last 10, even the real browning happens in the last 5 minutes. If you don't see that even browning, you can set your timer to an extra 5 minutes just to make sure you get that color, because it's really hard to overcook this cheesecake because the color is your guide, and it is so very thick. Now, this caramelization actually has a scientific term. It's called the Maillard reaction. And that is the moment, it happens to cakes, it happens to breads, It happens to anything that has sugar and protein together in it. So you've got the cream cheese, the protein in the cream cheese, we have the sugar we've added, the natural sugars there, and at a certain temperature, once they hit a certain temperature, and that surface temperature, I believe, oh, shoot, I just looked it up. I'm not gonna say what it is in case I get it wrong, but once the surface achieves that certain temperature in the oven, the sugar and the proteins collide, and that's what promotes this browning, that caramelization. And so that's why you get, and with that comes that beautiful flavor. It is actually caramelized. So now, to serve this cake, this is why it just pops off. This is why I invert the cheesecake pan, so it comes off easily. But you're meant to serve this in its paper wrapper. So it's a fantastic cheesecake. If you're going to someone's house and need to take a dessert, it transports easily. And this is why I like to serve it on a cutting board like this. And then you just simply unwrap it. And it's okay if little pieces of cheesecake kind of fall away. So you can see where a little batter gets stuck on the paper. But this, to me, is just so immensely appealing and appetizing. I love that sort of rustic, wrinkly look you get to it. Oh, that's a nice side to it. And then to cut the cheesecake, just like a regular cheesecake.
My yard is 350.
350. Okay. Michael looked it up for us. The Maillard reaction kicks in at 350 Fahrenheit, so that's 180 Celsius. So you actually, the ingredients have to get that hot themselves, not just the oven temperature for this to happen. Oh, we've got some good questions. Before I cut into the cheesecake and say goodbye, let's get a few more questions in here. Good question about letting the cheesecake cool. So I let it cool for 2 hours on a rack so that the air can get underneath it before it went into the fridge, and I let it chill overnight, minimum 6 hours, because this does have such a soft center to it. You want to make sure you give it time to set. And it, raisins. Oh, I see another question. I see the thread is moving, so I just got another good question I want to answer about my blueberry muffin recipe. But what was I talking about? Yeah, letting it set, chill, give it good time to set. So that question about, you tried my blueberry muffin recipe, but you replaced the blueberries with raisins and chocolate, but you found the blueberry muffin a bit dry. That's because the blueberries add moisture to the recipe. So the blueberries, as they cook within the batter, kind of produce steam, and that keeps the batter nice and moist in the muffin itself. So the substitution, good call, but add maybe an extra 2 tablespoons of liquid to the recipe to balance out the lack of moisture from the fruit itself. Very, very good question. Hermione is asking, can we serve this with ice cream? Yes, I think it would be delicious. I think fresh fruit, even cut up orange segments. What I want you to appreciate is the beautiful simplicity. So I wouldn't drizzle this with a chocolate sauce or a caramel sauce, because I want you to appreciate the caramelization. You could consider adding vanilla or lemon zest if you wanted to, but again, I think the beauty of this cake is appreciating it for what it is. So I'll wipe off my knife in between cuts. Audrey's asking about buttermilks. Substitutions for buttermilk that's a question I get quite often. And buttermilk is called for in recipes because the acidity is usually there either for flavor or to react with the leaveners in your recipe, your baking powder and baking soda, to create your own buttermilk. If you need a cup or 250 ml of buttermilk, measure that in milk, pull out 2 tablespoons or 30 ml, and replace that with 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. 1 is even sufficient, but if you really want to get that full leavening and thickening power, 2 tablespoons is best. Give it a stir, give it a second to sit, and you'll find the milk curdles and tightens up. It won't look as pretty as buttermilk, but that will give you what you need in your baking recipe. Very, very good question. we've got, now when it comes to making chocolate, there are different brands you can use. What's most important when you're baking with chocolate, like my chocolate orange mousse that I just made on Monday on the live stream, you need to use couverture or baking chocolate. So a chocolate bar or chocolate candy will not melt as smoothly as couverture or baking chocolate that is found in the baking section of your grocery store. So here is a slice of, ooh, there's a little piece just waiting for me. You can see it slices cleanly, but it's amazingly light. It is really, really fluffy. Okay, that is one time I'm really happy I licked my finger. And so, as I said, simplicity is the key. Serve this with fresh berries. Oh, and thank you. We cracked 400 likes. That is awesome. It's so great to hear from you. I'm so glad you joined me. We're still getting some great questions, so I'm not going to sign off yet as we chatted about this. Ghazi is asking for a substitute for cream of tartar, lemon juice or white vinegar in a small measure. If it's being added to egg whites to coax the maximum volume, it's a 1-to-1. So a teaspoon of cream of tartar, just add a teaspoon of white vinegar or lemon juice and you're all set to go. And substitute for Dutch cocoa powder, ooh, that's a tough one because it is treated to neutralize its acidity. And I don't know that there's a way, you can't just simply add baking soda to your recipe because you'll actually mess with the other reactions, with the other ingredients. So Dutch process is called for, you can use conventional, but if you're using it in cakes, you might find your cakes dome a little bit because they rise up more because your leaveners are reacting. Oh, so if anything, maybe reduce your leaveners, but I haven't put that to the test. That's a very good question though. Ahmad says, this looks like a brie cheese. Let me tell you, it does not taste like brie cheese. And thank you for joining me once again. We've got a question about, do I make my own vanilla extract? I do, because not to use in all my everyday cooking, I actually go through too much of it. But so that I'm not wasting vanilla bean pods after I've scraped out the seeds, what I do is I put them into a little mason jar and I usually use what I have on hand, honestly, but I keep it relatively neutral. So like a brandy, I find rum is too strong. It has its own flavor. People say bourbon, but bourbon, it also refers to a type. Bourbon Madagascar vanilla is a type of vanilla bean. It's not necessarily because bourbon is used to make the vanilla extract. So I favor a brandy. Vodka can be a bit harsh, but you do need alcohol to preserve the bean and the flavor itself. If you use water, you'll find that after a while, the vanilla beans will just break down and you could get some mold or bacteria growth. So you need that alcohol in there. All right. And we've got some cheesecake jokes happening here. That's hilarious. I'm not sure what the Bourneville cocoa powder question is. And Hermione says she's using vodka for her vanilla. You're perfectly fine. It's neutral so that all you're going to taste is the vanilla when you let it. And it takes a few weeks for that vanilla flavor to cook through. Oh, here's a good question. Ladislav is asking, should this cheesecake be served cold or at room temperature? You definitely store it cold. I enjoy the taste and texture of a chilled cheesecake, but this can handle sitting out for a little bit because it has been so thoroughly cooked. So if it warms up a little bit, but I wouldn't serve it at room temperature. You don't want this sitting out for too long. A very good question. I love that these questions are still coming in. Can I use, Zanib is asking, can I use fresh cream cheese instead of processed? I would say definitely give it a try. A fresh cream cheese may not have quite the level of tang or tartness that a prepared cream cheese has, but I would give it a go because the set and the structure, and you might get a nice creamy dairy flavor from using a fresh cream cheese. So I would give it a try. Oh, and hello from Canada, Terry. And Missouri. Oh, and Shailene is asking, is there a way to make my chocolate chip cookies less sweet? And yes, the sugar is there not just for sweetness, it's there for structure. It gives your cookies body. You can play with replacing some of the granulated or brown sugar with a syrup instead. If you were to use a maple syrup or an agave syrup, because of its liquid state, you would need less of it, but it would still hold the cookie together, and you would likely get the caramelization because dry sugar has to liquefy and then reset as a cookie bakes, where the syrup wouldn't. So that would be a good place to start in terms of trying to reduce the sugar, but not compromise the texture. Oh, and hello to Debbie in Kingston. Oh, and now Debbie is saying she had a time with a tougher cheesecake crust as opposed to a softer cheesecake. Sometimes they go soggy. And that is then what I would do if you love that recipe, Debbie. My advice for someone who was watching who had problems with a soggy crust, I suggested adding extra butter and then baking it a little longer and making sure the cheesecake is fully cooled before it puts in the fridge. For the opposite, if your crust is too crispy or dry, reduce the butter by a little bit and take a couple minutes off of the bake time when you're just baking to set the crust, and that should balance it out a little bit for you. These are great questions, including Alden, who is commending me for the fact that I've been holding this cheesecake in my hand for 3 minutes and not taking a bite. Well, I think time to take a bite. We've got lots of excitement and questions. And yes, we need to talk about this texture. So let me cut into it. So the texture is very much like a New York cheesecake, but it's got a fluffiness. I hope you can pick up on that. Michael is zooming in. So you can really pick up on that fluffier texture. It's got a light airiness, because remember that quantity of eggs, 5 eggs plus a yolk. When I first played with this recipe, I put in 6 whole eggs, and it's funny how just that addition of the 1 extra egg white set it too much. It was too much, and it became about the egg, not the cream cheese. This is silky. It melts on the tip of your tongue the way creme brulee does at the first bite, and that's because I took from the center. But if you go to the back, it's a little more dense, a little more set. It's still